All right, so we are going to be covering the introduction to hero myths, the second part, and we're going to be focusing on the monomyth. So last session, what we talked about were actually several things. We talked about what it is to be a hero. We talked about essential characteristics versus accidental characteristics. So that's a distinction that I gave you guys. And the three essential characteristics of a hero. Who remembers what those are? You can text them or shout it out if you want. One of them is a particular virtue that's really important for heroism. We'll probably have a lot more to say about that as we go through the semester. Okay, that's actually an accidental characteristic, bigger than life. And we talked about an accidental characteristic being larger, more powerful, those types of things. Conquest of death would be one of the elements of the narrative. That's why I made a mistake and said there are two essential characteristics. I meant two essential elements of the narrative, but three essential characteristics of a hero. Role model, good was one of them. Again, we're modeling virtues, values of a particular culture or universal human virtues and values, or even challenging those types of things. And then out of those virtues and values, we said the premier virtue, which relates to fear, is the virtue of, okay, good, provider, savior figure. That was the number third characteristic. And then that virtue that I'm trying to pull out of you, courage. Very good. All right, so you get those three. And then the narrative we've spent most of the time talking about, which had the two elements, the conquest of death and then the adversary. Okay, the catalyst for the most part for the heroic transformation, and then the completion is the conquest of death. And then we looked at common elements in hero stories that have a general pattern. And then we looked at those particular characteristics or elements in reference to the Star Wars series, okay, the entire 9 movies. And whether you like the movies or not, we still were able to at least identify how those elements were woven into all 3 trilogies. And I think we finished up not long after that with a discussion of the transcendental or transcendent purpose of heroic narrative. And the whole idea there is going back to the idea of the hero story as a transformative experience that is supposed to draw in the observer, watcher, reader, or participant. I like to call the person that, engages in the myth a participant, because you're really going through an initiation along with the characters. The character transforms and develops certain things. The audience is supposed to kind of vicariously live the hero's role and come out with some kind of benefits embedded in them that provide some kind of calling to a particular way of life. Okay, this idea of calling to a higher purpose. So today we're going to turn our attention now to the monomyth, and that may be a phrase that you've heard of before you even took this course, but it could be used in a few different ways. So when we talk about monomyth, the word literally means the one story, and it's basically the recognition of a universal pattern in hero stories. So I kind of like this visual, and because there's an idea with the monomyth that all these stories are really the same, yet each one is at the same time unique, right? So when I say there's only one story, I mean there's a pattern that emerges, but each individual story is going to have their own twist on it, their own particular peculiarities, and those would have to do very often with the culture that produces the story or the time period when it's produced. So it's interesting to look at the story at both levels, what's the same and what's different. And this is a way that we can approach world mythology in general. So let's take a look at the monomyth, and let's start with, again, defining it, the one story. It's composed of all of these motifs, and if I have used the word and have failed to define it in the past, I probably should do that. A motif would be, an image, a scenario that repeats itself over and over again. Okay, and we often call these things archetypal. Archetypal would have to do with this being kind of a core model or pattern. Okay, so the monomyth can form a cycle that we could look at as having 4 distinct phases. You could also look at it as having 3 distinct phases, and I'm going to do both in the course of this lecture, okay? And the phases are actually going to correspond to various cycles that we observe when we approach reality, okay? So I'm actually going to use some analogy and some comparison to cycles that you guys might be familiar with that are general human experiences. We'll call these the natural cycles of life. Let me back that visual up because I want to hit these one at a time. Okay, so the first cycle that we could talk about, that's the natural cycle, is the daily cycle, right? You have the sunrise in the morning, the zenith at high noon, sunset as we approach evening, and then darkness for the nighttime. Okay, and it repeats again day by day by day. You also have a cycle that the month goes through, which is based not on the sun but on the moon, the waxing, the full moon, the waning, and the new moon phases, and then the next month repeats itself again. Then you could break it down into the entire year, which forms a cycle going back to its relationship to the sun, right? So you're talking about the changes of the season from spring to summer to fall and then to winter. And then if we want to go beyond just a single year and go to the entire lifetime of an individual, we could talk about the human life as being divided up between childhood, adulthood, old age, and death. Okay, so that's just one way that we can conceptualize these patterns. And we're going to look at how the story actually can correspond to this type of pattern. Now, what's interesting about the story, or actually the division into 4 phases, is 3 of the phases, the top 3 phases, correspond to what we think of as the life portion of the cycle. And then the bottom phase, the death. Okay, so whether we're talking about nature, we can think of the winter time as a time when things die. You can think of the nighttime when the sun is down as a time, again, that represents death, and so on. Okay, now, of course, there's a distinction between life and death. That's very important. And all of the stories we're going to talk about, these hero stories, remember, have to have a theme of conquest of death. So the death is going to become really, really important, whether you look at it as a literal, physical death or a symbolic death. Okay. As a matter of fact, we're probably going to talk about it more often as a symbolic thing than anything else. So we can draw a line through our diagram, which is going to separate the upper phase of the cycle from the lower portion of the cycle. Now, with the 4 phases, when we look at literature, okay, this is based on analysis by Northrop Frye, and a few other writers have actually observed this as well. You could break literature or story forms down into 4 basic types that correspond to the 4 phases. We're going to call these now the monomyth, right? Instead of childhood, adulthood, old age, and death, we've replaced them with comedy, romance, tragedy, and the anti-romance. So comedy is like the springtime, right? It's a time of security. It's a time of moving from bondage to freedom. That's the idea in traditional comedy. And you don't want to think comedy in literary forms is necessarily funny, though comedy does tend to have humorous elements to it. Modern comedy, of course, and even some ancient, middle comedy and new comedy in the ancient world, focused on even some slapstick type of things. But, old comedy that was developed in the ancient Greek world generally could be humorous, but the idea that made it comedic was the idea of moving from kind of a negative to some kind of positive outcome. At least one of the ways that comedy is viewed is it ends up on a up note or a high point. And they could be very critical of culture, and some of the same things that we see in trickster myths go on in comedy, as you wouldn't be surprised. Anyways, too much on comedy, and probably not enough on comedy at the same time. Romance would be at the top. Romance is kind of the corresponding genre that corresponds to summer. This is the ideal, right? This is the era of freedom and adventure. And it's not surprising that we refer to a lot of the stories as romances. A lot of the stories we're going to talk about, like the Arthurian romance. Okay, these are adventure stories. These are heroic stories. Traditionally, we don't think of it that much today because we tend to think of romance as something that has to do with love and that type of modern conception, not necessarily the way we viewed it in the Middle Ages. Tragedy, type of literature that moves kind of on a downswing. This is corresponding to the fall. You're moving from perfection to catastrophe, for bliss to catastrophe, and it ends often in suffering. So we think of these as more of a sad ending rather than the happy ending of a comedy, because obviously we're on the downswing in this cycle. And then the bottom portion is sometimes referred to as the anti-romance, which is corresponding to winter, the life that we dread, the life as we wish it never to be, the consequence and ultimate fate of the life cycle, right? It all ends in death. But of course, it's a cycle, so it repeats itself again and again. And all stories, I mean, the idea of a four-phase monomyth is that not just hero stories, but all literature falls somewhere on this cycle, okay? Aristotle also broke literature down, and when I'm saying literature, I'm talking basically types of poetry and theater, down into a fourfold division as well: epic, lyric, tragic, and comedic, which roughly correspond to the same types of pieces that I put here. We'll talk about Aristotle a little bit later, but not in connection to the kind of the four-phase pattern, but you'll see where I'm going with Aristotle. Hopefully it'll be interesting. Now, let's turn our attention now to analyzing the cycle, not as a four-part thing, but as a three-part thing. We'll call this a tripartite analysis of the hero myth. And it's based on kind of a human tendency to want to conceive of reality in very cut and dried fashion, where we have clear boundaries. And when I talked about knowing, back when we did the trickster introduction, I talked about the idea of how we cannot comprehend chaos. If things don't have form or structure, they're kind of beyond our understanding. And the idea of form is something that brings not only the possibility of knowledge, but the idea of things being of certain types. And I don't want to go back into that right now, though I may mention it off and on as we go a little bit later on. But this idea of ordering the universe and how we understand it, we have a tendency to do this when we conceptualize reality. We view things in sometimes a binary fashion or a tripartite fashion, or in groups of four, or even as singularities, unities. Okay, so we have a tendency to want to group things into kind of those small numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Much beyond that, we don't tend to, conceptualize. Now, it's an oversimplification, obviously, when we approach reality and try to, sum everything up into simple, pairs of opposites or trinities or stuff like that, because reality is infinitely more complicated than that. But we do this partly because it's easier, partly because there may be actually something to reality that lends itself to this kind of analysis. So let's talk about how this might be done. So for instance, and I'm using these just by way of introducing us to the way the story will be set up, but one way of conceptualizing the universe or the material universe is to conceive of it as composed of three parts, like matter, space, and time, or three aspects. I can't really talk about time as a thing necessarily, but matter, space, and time would be one way to conceive of the material universe. And then within each of these, we can think of them being divided into three as well. So matter we can conceive of as solid, liquid, gas. Space we can think of as three-dimensional, right? Length, depth, width. Time we think of it in tenses, past, present, future. And of course, we break those down into more specific variations, but it's all based on this general three-part structure. We do the same thing when it comes to language, and a lot of this theory has to do in analysis of Indo-European language in particular, and Indo-European culture. But there's a tendency in these languages from that particular family to group nouns, for instance, into different genders like masculine, feminine, and neuter. In verbs, we have not only past, present, future, but we also have first person, second person, and third person perspectives. When it comes to relationships, you think of there being at least two parts to a relationship, but anytime you have two members of a relationship, you've got a third thing that is the thing that brings them together in the relationship. So we could talk about like a parent-child relationship, just for example. We have the parent, you have the child, and then you've got the thing that unites them, which we can call the filial relationship or paternal relationship or something like that. When we talk about knowing something, as subjects, we want to know some kind of object out there, And we do that through some kind of cognition. Something has to unite us to it. And that was a big mystery for the ancient philosophers. How do we come to know in our minds the thing that's outside of our mind? It's actually something common in modern philosophy. Okay, there's always that third thing that has to unite the two. Even our definition of knowledge historically has often been described as justified true belief. That's the JTB theory of knowledge. So there's three things that have to be the case for you to be able to claim that you know anything. You could also talk about communication between any two people. This is part of the relationship description, right? So you could have a writer or an artist or a speaker who's addressing an audience, and the thing that is going to allow that communication has to be some kind of medium of transmission, right? The writer can, use the pen and ink to communicate to the audience, or the artist through his painting, or the speaker through the, sound waves. There's always three parts to these relationships, okay? So that's part of this idea of conceptualizing the world in a tripartite way. This thesis actually is a little bit deeper than that, so let me just give you a little bit more before I move on past it. Not that I'm going to completely move away from it, because we're going to spend a bit of time dealing with it in a second with hero stories. But Georges Dumézil was a French anthropologist, studied language, myth, and society, particularly with respect to Indo-European societies. And he came up with the idea or the observation that we tend to think in threes, right? That Indo-European culture, its myth was composed of threes all over the place, in its literature and even society in general. So, he made an observation of this phenomenon with the language, which I just mentioned. But society itself, right? You've got like three basic groups. So we can think of, upper class, middle class, lower class, or you can think of the rulers, the warriors, and the producers within any society, right? Almost like a pyramid structure. And that was true. That even is, comes across in Plato's writing. When Plato talks about the ideal society and the republic, he talks about at the top you've got the philosopher king, and then you've got the guardians, and then you've got the people that do the labor underneath that. So the entire state is going to function in this according to this division, okay, division of labor. In myths, we see this manifest in things like the three fates, the three furies, the Graiai, the Gorgons, the three brothers like Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. In Indian mythology, Hindu mythology, you've got the Purusha creation from the Purusha man, which different parts of his body give birth to the Brahmins, Kshatriya, and Vaishya, which are the three upper castes, or rather Varna, in Hindu society. And even the Trimurti, which is three faces of Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu. We'll talk a bit more about Hindu mythology and Indian mythology when we get to the Ramayana later this semester, but you're going to see some of these patterns. Alan Dundes, who's a folklorist studying American folklore, actually takes a hold of this tripartite ideology thesis and then observed how American folklore follows some of these same patterns. And this might be, something that you're more familiar with, the way jokes are told. Now, I don't know very many jokes, or at least out of the thousands I've heard in my lifetime, I can maybe remember two. But I do recognize this kind of pattern. You've probably heard jokes like this where, a minister, a priest, and a rabbi walk into a bar, and then the joke goes on from there. A lot of times there's these three core characters. Okay? When we look at nursery rhymes and songs, things you might learn when you're a kid, you have often a triple repetition or something in the rhythm that has a three-part. So Mary Had a Little Lamb is a good example, right? It's Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. There's a repetition. Or London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down, right? Hickory Dickory Dock. You've got stories like the Three Blind Mice, the Three Little Pigs, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Over and over, you've got that interesting phenomenon emerge. Same thing when we have general ways of abbreviating, the way we use acronyms. Not that this is the only way to do it. There's obviously acronyms that have, 4, 5, 6 letters long. But, most of them, the majority, are very quick and easy 3 letters, right? JFK, FDR, ABC, CBS, UFO. List goes on. We have a tradition also in the West of having 3 names. Again, this is not a universal custom, but a lot of times first, middle, and last name. Again, these are generalities. I don't want to say this is always the case. That's always dangerous to do that, and I just did that. So I don't know if you can see the the contradiction there, but hopefully you can. Anyways, folk speech, right? Good way to learn a lesson is remember kind of the key words. What do you do if you catch fire? Stop, drop, and what? Roll. right? Stop, look, listen. This is true for every Tom, Dick, and Harry. I mean, you know all these little phrases, okay? So it's all around us. In fact, the entire system of government that we have, broken down into 3 branches. Education system, primary school, secondary school, higher education, where you learn reading, writing, arithmetic, go on and get a bachelor's degree, master's degree, doctor's degree, okay? The pattern goes on and on and on. So I'm probably just beating a dead horse at this point, okay? 911, right, call 911. Why isn't it the full, 7 number? Actually longer than that now, 9 number. 10, whatever it is. Yeah, good. All right. So now let's go back and let's pay a little bit of attention to Plato and Aristotle. And if you haven't studied philosophy, I would always recommend taking an introductory course. You're going to be exposed to some different ways of thinking and some of the greatest ideas that humankind has ever produced. And invariably, you're going to encounter these 2 big names. These are probably the most important thinkers in the history of the Western tradition, and almost every philosopher since have been responding in some ways to Plato and Aristotle. So let's start with Aristotle's view on the human, rather not human, but life. Okay, Aristotle says all life, what characterizes something as a living thing is that it has a soul. And he says there's basically 3 types of souls. There's the vegetative, the sensitive, and the rational. And they're hierarchically arranged, so that the vegetative, which would be the kinds that are, capable of reproduction, growth, and nutrition, that would be common to plants. But then you have animals, which would be sensitive souls. They've got all of the lower functions of reproduction, growth, and nutrition, but also, sensations and emotions and things like that, and mobility. That would be a higher soul because they've got more functions. And then at the top of the hierarchy would be human beings, which have the further added faculties of rationality and intellection and stuff like that. Okay, so there's 3 types, generally speaking, of living creatures, according to Aristotle. Also in the Aristotelian tradition, there is an idea that the human mind has actually 3 acts by which it understands and approaches reality. So this would be probably less known unless you go on and study the entire scholastic tradition in some depth, but there's what's called the understanding, the judgment, and the reason, kind of working from bottom to top. And the understanding is the most fundamental first act of the mind. This is the ability of the mind to apprehend concepts, which we express in terms. So I can approach the world and I see, oh, cool, good. Id, ego, superego. Your Freudian stuff. That very, very much is related to some of the stuff that we're talking about. Good. Matter of fact, that's going to be very similar to what we're going to talk about with Plato in just a second. So very nice observation. So again, approaching the world, I can look at something like a dog. And I always use dogs for some reason when I do little logical examples, but you get a concept of what it is to be a dog, right? We understand the concept, we express it in a term like dog, we've got our understanding. The next act of the mind is called the judgment, where we make a claim about the existence of something like the dog is brown, or the dog is right there, or the dog is alive. Okay, so those would be judgment claims, and we express those not in just terms like dog, but in sentences or propositions where we have an entire structured group of words. And then the third act of the mind is where we will reason. We'll move from propositions and link them up in such a way as to draw conclusions from that and inferences. And that's the most complicated act of the mind. Okay, but it all depends on these lower acts. First we conceive, then we judge, and then we reason. So human thought kind of works according to this model as well, which is very interesting, at least I think. All right, let's bring in Plato. Now Plato is going to talk about the human soul. And for Plato, the human soul also has 3 parts to it: the noetic, the thumotic, and the epithumotic. The highest is the noetic, which is our reason. The thumotic is the spirit, and the epithumotic is the appetite. Okay, so we can think of the reason as the part of us that does everything that I just mentioned, conceptualizes and draws inferences and stuff like that. The thumotic is the part of us that kind of presses us forward, tries to motivate and move us. We can think of this as centered in the heart or the chest, whereas the reason is in the mind. And then the epithumonic, the appetite, has to do with our desires and emotions and the aspects of us that crave things or want to pull things in towards us. And those are usually associated with the belly and the lower and the genitals. Okay, so Plato understands that human beings are, we're not just rational animals. We're a lot more complicated than that. We've got all of these different aspects to us. Okay, now when we go back, let's go back to Aristotle, and then we'll go back to Plato again. So Aristotle gives us an account of virtue, and again, remember how important virtue is for the hero narrative, right? This is what the role model aspect of the hero is all about. When Aristotle talks about virtue, he says a virtue is a mean between two extremes that he calls vices. All right, so again, when you understand what a virtue is, you understand it in a tripartite way. So for instance, picking up on that idea of courage, I said courage is in respect to fear. Now fear, when you have too much of it or an excess of fear, you're paralyzed by it, and that's a vice, to be too fearful. If there's a defect, meaning not enough fear, then you're going to be rash and foolish. You're going to do self-destructive things. You're not going to, conduct yourself in an appropriately healthy way. But the person who has the right amount of fear that they can manage properly, that's where the virtue of courage manifests itself. It's right in between. And it's going to be different, he says, for everybody, because everybody has a different middle point. It depends on what you need to do, right? The soldier, for instance, is going to have a certain type of fear that maybe the average grocery store clerk is not going to have, okay? So again, it's still viewed as a middle point between two extremes, so it's in a tripartite analysis. Now, when we take certain virtues, Plato talks about cardinal virtues, we can line these up with the three parts of Plato's soul. So we have courage, which is in the middle here. That lines up with the part of us that Plato would call the thumatic part. Courage is the part that goes with the spirit. It's the virtue of the spirit. The virtue of the reason is the wisdom. And the virtue with respect to our appetites is what he calls self-control. Okay? Now there's four cardinal virtues. The fourth one is justice, and that's kind of a balance of everything else. But for our purposes, there's wisdom, courage, and self-control because there are three parts of the soul that they line up with. All right? Now, one of the really neat things that you're going to see when you read enough hero stories or look at the way, these kinds of stories are told, even in modern literature, I'm going to give you some examples in a second. It's very often the case that you're going to have certain characters that line up more or less with a different part of the human soul. You'll have characters that are more about wisdom, others that are more about self-control, others that are most about courage. Though courage, remember, is central. It's the main virtue of the hero, but it's not necessarily the only virtue of the hero. So let's take a look at how certain archetypal heroes can be placed into kind of a triumvirate, right? A triumvirate that comes from the Latin word for three men. Famous triumvirate in ancient Roman history was Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. So it's a union of three guys. Let's look at heroes that might line up with the body. We can call those the epithumatic heroes, the heroes of the mind, which would be the noetic heroes, and then the heroes of the spirit, which would be the thumatic, the middle type. Let's start with the Trojan War. So in the Trojan War, the three big epic heroes, the central character of the three big epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, would be these three guys: Achilles, Odysseus, and Aeneas. Achilles, if you know anything about the character, is clearly a hero that lines up with the epithumatic aspects, the emotions primarily. Achilles is a man of rage and anger. Okay? Odysseus, on the other hand, lines up with the rational aspects. He's the one who's known as being crafty and wily. He's the trickster of the heroes. Okay, now both of them are brave and courageous, but they have other aspects of themselves that kind of dominate their personality. Whereas Aeneas, who is the hero of Virgil's Aeneid, is more balanced. He's not prone to rage. He's smart, but he's not known for his trickery the way Odysseus is, and he's typically the self-controlled, focused, disciplined hero that becomes the model for Roman civilization. Okay, so you could use these, and you could pick other characters from ancient mythology and kind of place them in these categories too. The neat thing is, though, when we have actual stories where you have a trinity of characters, the same pattern often emerges. So for instance, any of you guys that are, and I think I remember some of you being Star Trek fans, the original Star Trek had basically three main characters. There are always peripheral characters, but the three main characters were clearly Bones, Spock, and Kirk. Bones is definitely the kind of the surly, cranky, more emotional figure, whereas Spock, clearly unemotional, purely logical, right? He kind of lines up with the mind. And then there's Kirk, who is the main character, the central figure, and this is usually the case. The central figure in a trinity of characters is usually the hero that represents the spirit, the heart of the group, right? It's kind of a balance between the others, but, he's his own thing, okay? So Star Trek does it, and what about, you guys maybe give me some answers here, because I'm going to bring up Star Wars next, meaning the original series. Who were the three main characters in the original trilogy? And where might each of them line up on this diagram? Feel free to type it in the chat and see if you guys have it. I know somebody's got an idea. And if you don't, that means you weren't paying attention last week. Not Anakin. I'm talking about the episodes 4, 5, and 6. Luke, good. And who are his two buddies? Kind of. Yeah, Anakin you could put with the body. That's a good point, because Anakin's clearly very emotional. That's his whole problem, right? His emotions get in the way of his calling as a Jedi. Okay, Luke is the spirit. Very good. He's the central figure, which again is the case. Leia and Han would be the other two. So where would you place each of those guys? Who would be the body? Who would be the mind? Think of their personalities. Think of their goals, their pursuits. Han is definitely the body. Very good, right? He's kind of the greedy smuggler. And then Leia is the rational one, the level-headed one, the one that has the smarter ideas, like how to get out of the Death Star, etc. So very good, very good. So there's our Trinity from Star Wars. Let's go on to some other things. This one I think you'll all be familiar with. Harry Potter. Everybody knows Ron, Hermione, and Harry. Harry is the central character, so he's the spirit. Hermione, everybody knows, is going to be the rational one. And then Ron, not by default, but if you actually read the stories and pay attention, he's always the one that's kind of upset or angry about something. Not that the others don't have emotions, because remember, these are human, three-dimensional characters. They all have personality, but, you put them where they most line up. Okay, so Ron, Hermione, and Harry, we'll look at them later this semester. If you want to jump into the world of wonderful DC Comics. Again, it's a little bit more complicated. Might not be the best lineup, but possibly Superman, the physicality, his main feature. Batman, definitely the intellect, and Wonder Woman probably in the spirit role. It's kind of the DC Trinity. Who has the emotional range of a teaspoon? Batman or Superman? Or somebody else that I'm missing the conversation on? All right, so I gave you DC. How many of you guys are Avengers fans? Who would you say are the three core Avengers? Thinking of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Okay, Ron. Okay. The three figures that I guess the entire movie series originally started with. You can actually see that the original movies were kind of set up around these three characters, the ones that I'm thinking of. Who in the Avengers would fit with body, mind, spirit? And you could have probably a couple correct answers. Okay, Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor. Very nice. Very nice. I was about to ask, where they should go, but I think they got to go in this order. Thor, kind of the boisterous, emotional, kind of an angry character. We'll look at the movie later this semester. Obviously, Iron Man, the intellect, and Captain America, right, is the spirit. He's the unifying factor within the group. Okay. So yeah, that's kind of cool that they do this. So let's go back now and talk about the hero narrative and how it's structured in a threefold way. All right. Now Aristotle, we'll go back to him briefly because he actually gives us an analysis of drama. When he talks about drama, he says drama should be a unified whole. Any good story should be a unified whole, meaning it'll have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It needs to be kind of compact and encapsulate. It doesn't leave you hanging right at the end. So that's the characteristics of a good story. And this eventually emerges into kind of like the 3-act format. Aelius Donatus in the 4th century actually gives us analysis where he talks about a play or drama having protasis, epitasis, and catastrophe, which would be the introduction, Act 1, which is the being put forth, basically, protasis, and then Act 2, which is the rising and falling action, or the stretching. Epitasis is the stretching. This is where almost everything in the story takes place in Act 2. And then it concludes with Act 3, or the resolution, the overturning, which is what catastrophe means. Okay? And that analysis, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, can be applied to most plays and movies even today. Of course, there are other complicated ways of breaking these things down, and some people write, 4 5-act stories. But in general, we're going to be looking at things from a 3-act perspective, okay? And this is going to go right back to hero myths. So let's talk about the structure, how it's analyzed in a diagram form, all right? We've got Act 1, we've got Act 2, Act 3. Now, I am going to introduce some of the essential elements of the narrative here so to show you why it naturally breaks down into 3 pieces. Because if you remember, I said the heroic narrative has 2 essential elements. One is the adversary. The adversary is one that presents a challenge. Okay? And it's to the challenge that the hero is going to have to respond. And that's usually going to take place right at the end of Act 1 that moves you into Act 2. There's a call to adventure. There's something that happens that the hero needs to respond to. And this can happen really early on. So Act 1 could be very short. Act 2 is the huge portion of the story where you've got all the adventure, all the journeys and stuff like that, and it's really where the transformation takes place. You have the dynamic transformation of the hero, who then is moving towards a completion of the transformation by the end of Act 2, where you're going to have finally the climax, the conquest. Right? This is where the victory is going to be held. You get to the point where you might have a lot of different things that the hero has to overcome along the way, but there's usually a culminating moment where the things are the most at risk, the most dangerous situation right at the end. And by gaining your victory at the end and winning the reward, the thing that you're questing for, it kind of brings you back, and we have a resolution in Act 3. And that's usually also a very short part of the story. Okay? So those 2 essential elements really neatly break the story down into the 3 phases, or the 3-phase monomyth as opposed to the 4-phase monomyth. Okay? So let's take a look at the tripartite nature of the human experience now as a model for the hero's journey. Remember, I mentioned that you're supposed to participate in the hero's transformation in your own life. Okay? Now, the idea here is the hero's journey is your story. All right, each person identifies with, or is supposed to identify with, the hero vicariously. You live out the hero's adventures in a safe way through participating in the story. And subconsciously, we're going to experience a transformation, hopefully, along the way. We're going to gain some new insight, and we're going to emerge transformed. Again, it's going to be dependent on how often we allow ourselves to be impacted by a story, but hopefully you're going to get at least the moral of the story, which resonates with you on a deep level. That's that existential experience we're after. So the individual's heroic journey happens to be your life, right? So let's think of it now as the entire story as an analogy or a parallel to your individual transformation from childhood through old age. Right? The hero story parallels human life. That's why we can talk about childhood or the springtime of life as the comedy phase, the adulthood or the summer of our life as the romance, and then old age as the fall or the tragic phase, and then death. Okay, so why does the hero story work out in a certain pattern? Well, it's based, again, on how life has a natural pattern to it. So in your childhood, this is a time, and I want you to think now of those common elements we talked about before, the time where mentors come into your life. Yeah, there are midlife crises. That's good. Usually as we're transitioning back out of adulthood into old age, that's something I probably should add to the PowerPoint, so maybe I'll touch on that in a second. But yeah, childhood, we have these role model figures that are mentors to us, whether they're parents or teachers or other older individuals that prepare us and train us for what lies ahead. It's a time of really not knowing who you are. You're kind of exiled, again, in a certain sense. There's a loss of identity in the idea that we don't really know yet who we are. But at the same time, we've got a sense of potential. We've got a sense of destiny. We've got a sense of optimism as to what could be the case down the road in the future. We've got like this almost prophetic vision of what we want to happen. And, our imaginations run wild in those early years, and everything's somewhat innocent, again, depending on how you grow up. But at some point, childhood ends, and it ends at different times in different cultures. Traditionally, it would usually end around the time of 14 years old, where a boy would become a man in most cultures. Which is why I don't really include adolescence in here, because adolescence, in a way, is that call to adventure that moves you into the adulthood. Okay, but adulthood is the stage of struggle. This is the adventure phase. This is where you are faced with all the dangers. You're on your own. The mentors have kind of departed, or have taken a back seat role, or stood out of your way, and you are going to either have victory or fall somewhere in the course of this essential and long period of your life, right? Hopefully you're going to succeed and have a triumph and a conquest over death, but unfortunately most people bungle it. Or if you do bungle it, sometimes there's an opportunity to redeem yourself, so there's that idea of redemption that we see in these hero stories. But the ultimate quest is, the full maturity that we're after, the individuation, a unified self, a unified whole personality. And that requires dying and rising, which is why that's another essential. It's a matter of dying to who you used to be and becoming somebody new. See, I'm using death again as a metaphor. And now I guess is where you put in the midlife crisis, because at the end of all these adventures, the hero usually has to return home, right? You're moving out of that phase of adventure, and there's, as Joseph Campbell points out, a reluctance to return. Okay, we don't want to leave, that summer point, that romance point, the adventure of life, and move into old age. So I guess a midlife crisis is kind of the resistance to the transition back. But then we have old age. And if you've made it to a victory, you bring back at that point with you the transformation and the reward of knowledge that you've acquired. And then you can pass that on yourself to the next generation. You become the mentor. And then, of course, you die. Okay, so the hero story is exactly parallel to human life. So if you ask yourself, why is there a loss of identity? Why is there a call to adventure? Why are there all these elements along the way? It's because this is our journey that these hero stories encapsulate. Okay, pretty cool, I think. All right, let's take a look again at, actually using the same diagram here. As we progress through the hero's journey, I want you to notice that we're moving through the cycles in two directions simultaneously. We said we're moving from childhood through adulthood, but we're also constantly dying along the way. So it's almost like we're going into the underworld as we're progressing through the adventure, which is why the hero stories very often are going to have these moments where you have a descent and a return from the dead, because it's essential to our transformation that we continually die in a certain way. Okay, so think of you as moving through this cycle in both directions, not just in one direction. Now, let's take a look at Joseph Campbell. Okay, I mentioned him probably last lecture. Hero of a Thousand Faces is his most famous, at least I think it's his most famous book, where he looks at hero myths from around the world and shows that there's a general pattern. And I'll give you his pattern, a 17-stage breakdown in a little bit. I actually included the diagram of that pattern in Blackboard for you guys, so you could print it out and use it as you analyze your movies for your paper this semester. But his Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 is basically given the names of separation, initiation, and return. For him, the monomyth is one where the hero has a separation phase, an initiation phase, and then a return. All hero stories have these three phases. Okay, so as we go, feel free to use those three names when you analyze the movies that you're going to be writing on. Here are the 17 stages for Campbell. And I hesitate giving you this because the visual is probably going to be a little bit difficult to see because it's going to be kind of small on the screen. The other reason I kind of hesitate with the 17 stages of Campbell's monomyth conception is that a lot of stories don't have all of these stages, and they definitely don't have it all in the same order that he presents them in. So again, this is a one way of seeing it, and that's why I gave you kind of common elements last time. He gives you very specific 17 stages, so I'll just read through them, and you're going to start at the bottom of this diagram where it says monomyth, and in separation phase, or Act 1, there's the call to adventure. A refusal of the call, followed by some kind of supernatural aid, followed by a crossing of the threshold. We'll talk about thresholds later this semester, but the crossing of the threshold is the beginning of the initiation phase where you enter the world of adventure. You enter the belly of the whale, kind of a descent into the underworld. There are a road of trials, a meeting with a goddess, some kind of temptation, an atonement, an apotheosis, which I know I defined last time, ultimate boon, which is the quest, reward, the thing that you're after, usually a refusal to return, so I guess that's where your midlife crisis might come in, magic flight, a rescue from without, and that's where you cross back over the return threshold and you're in the regular world again, and you're now master of both realms, and you have the freedom to live. So that's his version of the hero story. There's a couple movies that I assigned you guys to watch that I'm going to provide worksheets for later this semester, and the worksheet is basically asking you to identify, as you watch the movie, the different stages in Campbell. You might be able to find all 17, you might not. It's actually a bonus task or whatever, bonus assignment, but it's a good exercise to walk through. So anyways, that's Campbell's version of the monomyth. Now, he's not the only one that breaks things down into these three patterns, these three stages. Arnold van Gennep, who writes about initiation rites and rituals, says every initiation rite, which again is about transformation, is broken down into separation, a transition, and an incorporation. So, for instance, if you were to think about an initiation rite where a boy becomes a man, maybe in a traditional society, maybe in a Native American tribe, for instance, the child who has been raised by the mom may be taken from the camp by the male elders in the community and brought out on a vision quest or some kind of ordeal, right? So there's a separation from the world you're used to. And in this ordeal, in this experience, you start to transition from boyhood to man. And sometimes it's a very painful experience. Sometimes it involves hallucinogenic drugs or dangerous situations or actual physical pain. But at the end of the transformation or transition phase, you are brought back to society and you're incorporated, meaning you become, again, part of the body in a new role, right? You're no longer a boy, now you're a man. Okay, so that's the essential pattern of all initiation rituals, okay, which again parallels hero stories, which are transitional, transformational initiations. Otto Rank, who is a student of Freud, somebody brought up, id, ego, superego earlier. Rank was a student of Freud's, and he analyzes mythology, and he focuses really on the childhood of the myth. He wrote a book called The Myth of the Birth of the Hero. And in it, he breaks the story down into true home, exile, and return, kind of a threefold pattern, which he identifies with what's called the family romance. We'll be looking at the family romance later this semester. Matter of fact, I'm going to deal with the family romance when we talk about the movie Thor. Okay, so as we do Thor, I'm going to kind of give you some exposure to how Rank would analyze mythology. And then you've got what maybe you've heard of as alchemy. Alchemy was a pre-science, kind of a magic/scientific pursuit that was about, again, transformation. The goal of alchemy, I mean, know the famous transformation that alchemists tried to do when it came to like base material, particular metal into another metal. Anybody ever hear of alchemy before? It's a lot more complicated than I'm going to make it sound right now. Not Freud, but Jung, equal exchange, okay. Jung did a lot of study in alchemy. Mircea Eliade actually wrote some works on alchemy. It's kind of pre-chemistry, I would call it. As a matter of fact, another person who wrote a lot, or didn't write a lot, but studied some alchemy, as she wrote her wonderful series, is J.K. Rowling. So when we get to Harry Potter later this semester, I'm going to talk a little bit more about alchemy and how it's a particular pattern. So alchemy has a 3-phase transition process. The stages are called the nigredo stage, the albedo stage, and the rubedo stage, or the dissolution, the purification, and perfection. So one of the quests in alchemy was to be able to change lead into gold, right? So you take the lead, and this is also based on kind of Aristotelian metaphysics, which I probably shouldn't get into. I'm always tempted to, but the idea is you dissolve the lead into its base matter or prime matter. You remove from it the form of lead until it's just pure matter, which has no form whatsoever. It's just undifferentiated stuff. And then you purify it in phase 2, and then you somehow impose a new form onto that base matter, the form of gold, and it's perfected. Okay, so in theory, you could change one element to another element through alchemy, and that was kind of one of the quests. Of course, it was never able to be done. So again, this could also be an analogy for the individual transformation, and I think Rowling uses that process of, the 3-phase alchemy to kind of illustrate Harry's transformation over the course of the 7 books in the series. Okay, so I'll come back to that later, so I don't want you to forget that. On your study guide, I know it mentions all of these, Campbell, Van Gennep, Rank, and the alchemical formula, as 3 different ways to look at the same basic tripartite structure of the narrative. Okay, so that is it for the monomyth portion. What I'm going to go to now, and this is the shortest portion of the intro, is going to be heroic concerns, and then after that I want to look at a couple types of heroes. All right, now what's a concern? This is a motivation. A motivation is a thing that moves a hero and propels them and encourages them to do what they're going to do. Why do they act, right? That's your motivation. It's a moving factor. And there are 4 primary or major motivations that I want to concentrate on. Not that they're the only motivations, but heroes very often will have one of these 4. The first one, and these are going to come again from Greek and Latin terminology, but the first one, known as time in the Greek, is honor. Okay, some heroes fight for honor, and that sounds like a really noble thing, because we think of honor today as, you want to protect your name, your word is your honor, your bond, your reputation. It seems to be somehow selfless and a good thing. Okay, now honor in the classical Greek sense is not necessarily the same thing it's related to our concept today, but it's a little different at the same time. It's more the idea of what you get as a reward for your great deeds. It has to do with value. Ultimately, the word means valuation. So the idea of getting something for your action is what we tend to think of as unheroic today, but it's very heroic in the past. And the idea of getting a reward for your activity is the idea of people recognizing your greatness, right? When you do the heroic thing, you should be rewarded, and you should be able to show that off so that people know how valuable you are, right? This is an outward sign. So you actually want the reward to be something you could show off and wear proudly. Okay, so honor was really important. Some heroes fight for honor. Right, soldiers' medals would be a good, the Nemean lion pelt for Heracles, very good. All right, I didn't think of the soldiers' medals, but that's the same type of thing, right? You wear that on your uniform so people know, what you've done, the deeds that you performed, and it is a sign of honor. So, yeah, there's still a very, very close relation to the ancient Greek thing, even though we tend to think of characters like Achilles, who fights for honor, as kind of petty, and we'll look at him later. Okay, so that's one thing we fight for, or they fight for. The next one is kleos, or fame, or glory. This is your reputation. Where honor is something you want now while you're alive, kleos, or fame, is what you want to live on after you die. Okay, it's what's remembered of you. Some heroes want their reputation. They want some sense of immortality. Gilgamesh is a good example of this. You want a reputation, people are going to talk about you when you're gone, and that motivates you to act and do great things, even if it costs you your own life, because, again, this lives on beyond your physical life. Other heroes are motivated by shame, or eidos. Shame is kind of the flip side of the coin from honor. Honor is what you get from your culture. Shame is what you want to avoid, right? It's a awareness of negative public opinion. You don't want people to look down on you, speak badly of you. That would be shameful. And maybe you act and do the brave thing because you don't want to look a coward in front of everybody. Hector in the Iliad, very much motivated at points by shame. Okay, if you've studied anthropology or sociology, you probably come across the difference between maybe shame culture versus a guilt culture. But he's a good example of that. And then the last is a Latin term, pietas, which means duty. It's a very Roman virtue, and it's a virtue that we tend to think of more as characteristic of heroes today, somebody that's doing something because of their commitment to others. It's a hierarchical responsibility for the ancient Romans, where you put the gods first, and then your country, your dependents, your family, and always at the very bottom is your duty to yourself, right? It's an idea of actually being selfless in that sense. Other interests come first. You need to sacrifice for those things. The picture here you might not recognize, whereas you can probably pick up Brad Pitt and some of the other photos here. This is Aeneas would be a great example of piety, and the photo that I included there is one of the old Hollywood stars, kind of from the B-movie days of the 1950s, Steve Reeves. I don't know if you guys have heard of Steve Reeves. He's one of the famous bodybuilders of the way back, played Hercules rather, in the old movies, and actually played Aeneas in a couple films, the Trojan War, the Trojan Horse, and a few others. But we'll read the Aeneid later. He's a great example of piety. As a matter of fact, that's his epithet. In the Aeneid, he's called Pious Aeneas by the poet Virgil. Okay, so those are the four major motivations. And then lastly, let's take a look at the basic types of heroes. We're going to say there are 5 basic types of heroes. And those are relative to the types of actions that the hero undertakes, and the types of things he fights, or the social concerns of a culture. So first you have the monster slayer, and we could say this is the most primitive type. They're going to be the ones that struggle against the forces of nature, the things that are out there trying to destroy civilization. The hero that is the monster slayer usually goes outside of society into the wilderness in order to make it safe for the people back home in society. They're kind of not the bridge, but the wall or the barrier between the dangers out there and the culture in here. Okay, so Heracles, great example of a monster slayer type. Now remember, heroes can be multiple types at once, but we're going to just distinguish them. You'll see the mixtures as we go. But monster slayer followed by the warrior. The warrior is the figure who fights for society, usually within society. They're the ones that fight with other men against other cultures. Because it's not just danger out there from nature that threatens a culture. It could be other cultures, right? Other bands that come through and want to scale your city walls or besiege you and take over. And, these are big concerns for ancient communities. First, people were worried about security against nature, right? You think of hunter-gatherer societies wandering around, prey for larger, more powerful animals. And then when we do settle down into communities, there's always, a scarcity of resources, and other communities or wandering groups coming through wanting to take your land and your city. Okay, so the warrior manifests there. Then you've got the mystical heroes. The mystical heroes would be, Achilles would kind of fall in the warrior category. Should probably give you an example for each of these. The mystical hero would have to do with the big concerns for human quest of knowledge, understanding, wisdom, enlightenment, immortality, the more abstract aspects. And again, this is not necessarily something that just evolves. As a matter of fact, the earliest hero story we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and a lot of people would classify Gilgamesh as kind of a mystical hero. He's in search, ultimately, of immortality, right? The conquest of death, these bigger questions. So they struggle against death, they seek to conquer mortality, and a Buddha would be another great example of a mystical type of a hero. Then you've got the seeker of kingship and country. This is the figure that struggles to fulfill some kind of destiny for their people, a leader of people. Could be a person who is trying to lead people in exile to a new homeland, maybe a Moses figure like we get from the Hebrew scriptures. He would be a good example of a seeker of kingship and country. Not that he's literally after kingship, it's the pattern that we're after here. Aeneas would be another great example of that we'll read about later. And then the last of the 5 types, and some people say the pettiest of the types, or the least common actually in traditional hero stories, is the romantic hero, in the sense of the hero that fights for love. Okay, there are different ways you could define romantic hero. This is one of them. So a culture will often observe the romantic hero after they've kind of addressed the more basic concerns of humanity. This is one of the reasons they say these kinds of characters show up later in world literature and not earlier, is because man was really more involved in, how to survive against nature and society and answering the big questions and nationhood and those types of things. And very late we'll eventually have those that fight for romantic love. So the Arthurian tradition, I think, is going to give us some great examples of romantic heroes like Lancelot, Romeo and Juliet, those types of things. Where does Percy Jackson fit in? That's a good question. It's obviously a very modern, story drawn on Greek mythology. I've only seen the movie once, and that was years ago. Definitely a monster slayer in part. Trying to remember exactly what the plot of the story was, whether there was some kind of mystical aspect to it. I think there was. But a lot of these stories also have romantic aspects to them. Harry Potter obviously has some romantic side storylines, but the primary story is not a romantic hero. As a matter of fact, most traditional heroes that look at times like romantic heroes, because they do have an interest in saving people that they love, are, when you boil it down, not really true romantic heroes, because often the love relationship is secondary to other concerns. And that's one way that you can kind of weed out the romantic hero from the other types of heroes. So we'll kind of investigate that as we go through the various stories. A good one to pay attention to, and I'll kind of just let you have this up front, because when you read it, you could think about it if you're aware of what you want to think about. When you read the Ramayana, Rama is a character who clearly fights for the love of his wife Sita, at least in part. But pay attention to the story in how, or rather the decisions that he makes, where romance is sometimes has to be set aside, right? The love of a woman has to be set aside for other goals and stuff. So I think that is one of the reasons that he's not really a romantic hero, even though there's a love relationship in the story that's really central to the plot. Okay, so those are the types of heroes. That's a lot of material for an introduction to hero myths. But hopefully you got now, after these 2 lectures, a pretty well-rounded understanding of the types of things we're going to be seeing. And what we're going to do next is dive into some actual stories, starting with the earliest and oldest hero story, and still I think one of the greats, the story of Gilgamesh. So that'll be on our next session.